The Second World War saw some massive naval battles. Some of the war's largest naval battles took place in the Pacific arena, with the Battle of Coral Sea of May 1942, seeing 27 ships from the United States Navy take on Imperial Japan's fleet of 53 vessels. And then, there's the legendary Battle of Midway a month later. It was a brutal campaign that dragged on for 3 days, and in which the United States lost approximately 362 men, 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 144 aircraft, while Japan lost approximately 3,057 men, 4 carriers, 1 cruiser, and literally hundreds of aircraft. However, even these battles pale in comparison to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which took place over 4 days in October 1944. It has been dubbed the largest naval battle in history, and probably the most significant single battle within this gargantuan war between U.S. and Japanese forces was the Battle off Samar, also known as the Sacrifice of Taffy 3. By the latter part of 1944, things were not looking good for the Empire of Japan. The Japanese had lost key strongholds in the Southwest and Central Pacific, and the United States was benefiting from what could be called its island-hopping campaign of seizing formerly Japanese-controlled islands and atolls throughout the Pacific region. The Allies sought to use what was still Japanese-controlled Philippines as their base for a series of battles that would finally cripple Japan's naval and aerial capabilities. By gaining control of the Philippines, the plan was to achieve 3 objectives. First, the Allies could seek to win key positions that would sever Japan's supply lines to the East Indies. Second, it would facilitate an invasion or neutralization of the island of Formosa, which is Taiwan today, as well as the East China coast. Third, it would ultimately provide launch pads for an attack on the islands of Japan itself. There was opposition within America's high command to this plan. Admiral Ernest J. King wanted to bypass the Philippines and attack Formosa directly, while Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall wanted to skip both the Philippines and Formosa and go directly for Japan's island of Honshu. However, it was General Douglas MacArthur who prevailed. He backed the Philippines plan. It was decided that Leyte Gulf in the central Philippines was the optimal focus for a major naval battle. This body of water was chosen because it had undefended approaches and also afforded good access to other islands in the Filipino archipelago. Taking Leyte Island, for example, would also isolate Japanese forces on the larger island of Mindanao to the south. The Allies undertook a series of strikes on Japanese air bases preceded the landings in the Philippines. These sporadic attacks were purposefully aimed at diverting the attention of the Japanese and included hits on the Ryukyu Islands, including Okinawa, on October 9th and 10th, northern Luzon in the Philippines on October 11th, and Formosa on October 12th and 13th. This was followed by amphibious landings at Leyte Island on October 20th. There was little resistance as the Japanese had got into defense farther inland, but things were looking up for the Allied forces. Nevertheless, the Japanese had to respond, and that they did with their counter-initiative, known as Shogo, or Victory Operation. The plan was to divert most of America's 7th Fleet to the north, so that the Japanese could then sweep in and attack the Allies on Leyte Island. In fact, the Americans fell for the ploy, leaving American amphibious forces on Leyte Island vulnerable to Japanese counterattack. What followed was an all-out naval battle based throughout Leyte Gulf, which means we can now focus on the battle off Samar. Samar is an island in the eastern part of the Philippines archipelago, and the country's 3rd largest after Luzon to the north and Mindanao to the south. As the Japanese swept southward toward the beaches of Leyte Island in order to recapture them, all that stood in their way were the group of ships designated as Taffy 3. On the morning of October 25, 1944, Taffy 3 was located about 40 miles or 75 kilometers off the island of Samar. It was a small task force consisting of the following: 6 escort carriers, namely the USS Fanshawe Bay, Gambier Bay, Callinan Bay, Kitkin Bay, St. Lo, and White Plain; 3 destroyers, the USS Heermann, Hoel, and Johnston; and 4 destroyer escorts, the USS Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts. The Taffy 3 force was under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. To say that the Americans were outnumbered was a huge understatement. The Japanese armada, led by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, included 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and more than 10 destroyers, as well as the jewel in Kurita's fleet, the super-battleship named Yamato. Taffy 3 knew the Japanese fleet was coming by intercepting their voice transmissions. This was confirmed by a visual sighting of anti-aircraft fire to the northwest. Sprague immediately ordered his destroyers to generate a smokescreen at 0716 and then again 0742, followed by heavy torpedo fire from the destroyers in the Taffy 3 task force. Taffy 3 then kicked off with an audacious torpedo attack by its 3 destroyers, led by the USS Johnston. It inflicted heavy damage to one of the Japanese cruisers, the Kumano, causing the Yamato to take evasive actions to avoid also being hit. 3 other Japanese cruisers, the Chikuma, Chokai, and Suzuya, were all sunk. Although the Americans were completely outnumbered in the water, they did have one major advantage over the Japanese: air power. Taffy 3's aircraft were soon joined by more aircraft from the nearby Taffy 2 fleet. The result was nearly 2 hours of incessant aerial bombardment to Japan's vessels. The Japanese had planned to have greater aircraft support as part of their Operation Shogo. However, many of their aircraft had been lost due to the raids on their air bases conducted by the Americans in the weeks leading up to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The USS Johnston was the one that managed to cause damage to the heavy cruiser Kumano. In the meantime, a second destroyer, USS Hoel, missed when it fired on the battleship Congo, suddenly finding itself boxed in and under fire by Japanese battleships and cruisers. The third destroyer, USS Heermann, was able to bypass the Japanese cruiser division and launch its own torpedo attack against the battleship Congo. The attacks by the 3 American destroyers had been frenzied, only adding to the surprise and then desperation of the Japanese. The waters churned with the zigzag of numerous American and Japanese vessels, with intense gunfire and torpedo strikes to match. All of this frenetic action added to the confusion, especially of the Japanese. More smoke was laid by the American destroyers to screen their task force, but wind direction had changed, and the American escort carriers were exposed to the Japanese heavy cruisers. These were strenuously engaged by the USS Samuel B. Roberts, Heermann, and Johnston, even as the USS Hoel began to slowly sink after being hit. Sprague then ordered the USS John C. Butler, Dennis, and Raymond to take up defensive positions between his aircraft carriers and the pursuing Japanese cruisers. Unfortunately, by this time, only the John C. Butler had torpedoes available. The escorts were all hit hard by Japanese firepower, yet they remained seaworthy and kept up their counterattacks. However, at around 0850, the Samuel B. Roberts received her first serious hit, followed by more hits from the Japanese, and finally a massive explosion caused by several 14-inch shells rupturing her fuel tanks. She was abandoned by her crew within 20 minutes. The Japanese pursuers then rained fire on the USS Johnston, which was already limping with one of her engines knocked out. Her crew was ordered to abandon ship at 0950. In the midst of all this, the American ships were given continuous and powerful air cover in the form of strafing from American aircraft. It's very probable that Taffy 3's task force would not have prevailed had it not been for the relentless air cover provided by aircraft from both Taffy 3 and Taffy 2. Rear Admiral Stump, the commander of Taffy 2, had ordered his air group to focus on crippling as many Japanese ships as possible. This was achieved to a great degree of success. The Japanese, however, did bring their own unique twist on air power that day. That had commenced earlier that same morning when the third of the so-called Taffy Brigade, Taffy 1, was attacked by 6 land-based planes from Japan's recently formed Special Attack Air Corps. That Japanese Air Corps would be better known by their unofficial name, the kamikaze. These were the Japanese airmen who essentially committed suicide by ramming their planes at top speed against enemy vessels. It's a name that became iconic and synonymous with the fervor of Japanese men for their emperor, not to mention Japan's desperate efforts to somehow win World War II. USS Santee of the Taffy 1 force would be the first American ship slammed by a kamikaze plane, which was also loaded with a 138-pound or 63-kilogram bomb. This resulted in hangar and flight deck fires. although didn't cause the ship to sink. Kamikaze attacks on the other Taffy 1 escort carriers were all near misses, but one thing was for sure: the Americans had never before witnessed this form of suicide enemy attack. The kamikaze aircraft then turned their attention on the ships of Taffy 3 at just before 1100 hours. The USS Kitcun Bay, Fanshawe Bay, and White Plains were all able to shoot down or deflect their kamikaze onslaughts. However, one of the kamikaze planes, a Mitsubishi A6M0, was damaged by anti-aircraft fire from the USS White Plains and slammed into the nearby USS St. Lo. Ordnance on board the U.S. ship ignited and blew off the ship's flight deck and elevator. The St. Lo sank in less than 30 minutes, consumed by fires. It would be the first American ship sunk because of a direct hit by a kamikaze plane. Due to the destruction caused by the American destroyers and waves of attack from above, Kurita was convinced that he was fighting a significant part of America's Third Fleet. He was wrong. Taffy 3, even with air support from Taffy 2, was a lot smaller in size and power. It was based on that incorrect assumption that Kurita made the decision to back off and retreat his remaining vessels. It was a huge mistake and a major turning point in the entire Battle of Leyte Gulf. A further misstep by Kurita was when he ordered his ships to move into a pursuit formation. There was confusion regarding anti-aircraft placements, and the Japanese vessels found themselves haphazardly placed. This severely hampered their firepower capabilities against their American adversaries, which should have been overwhelming. In fact, this ploy of making their ships take haphazard trajectories had been a constant feature of Japanese naval strategy, one that had on many occasions left their vessels isolated and more vulnerable to mass attacks during battles. The decision by Kurita to turn away from battle has divided historians for decades. Some believe that he genuinely assumed that he was up against a far larger American contingent and decided it was best to retreat. Others believe that he knew that Americans' air superiority would anyway eventually overpower his fleet. And then there are those that believe that Kurita suffered from a type of Hamlet syndrome, in which he became incapable of making a firm decision to continue with his attacks. All of the confusion and mayhem surrounding Kurita and his officers could not have helped. Whatever the reason, Kurita's withdrawal handed the Americans a victory that, at least on paper, looked highly unlikely. One cannot underestimate the ravages on clear thinking that occur when what is called the fog of war sets in. Interviews of some of the surviving Japanese naval officers by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey (USSBS) revealed that the Japanese had realized they were up against a smaller force than initially thought. However, by then it was too late. The Japanese were too dispersed and there was simply too much confusion. In this battle, it was the Americans who gained from the infamous fog of war. Japan's total losses in the Battle of Leyte Gulf were immense, including 3 battleships, 1 large carrier, 3 light carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, which amounted to 28 ships in total. More than 12,000 Japanese lives were lost. The Americans, by comparison, lost 12 ships in total and 3,000 men, or a quarter of what the Japanese lost in terms of men. Although not entirely defeated, the Imperial Japanese Navy would never again be the formidable offensive force it had once been. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was undoubtedly the beginning of the end for Imperial Japan. Although the Battle of Leyte Gulf included other important victories for the Americans in the Sibuyan Sea, the Surigao Strait, and off Cape Engano, it was the battle off Samar that really made the difference. Fortuitous it may even have been, but it was a victory for the ages. To this day, the Battle of Leyte Gulf remains the largest and most widespread naval battle in history. It's very likely we may never see the likes of it ever again.